been here. Okay, so I'm actually just before, we're going to go over time anyway, but I'm just going to say, shameless plug. So I got a recent paper out, it's not really anything to do with this, but it's called An Encounter with Death. Okay, Pascal, Michael, David Luke, Oliver Robinson. Check it out. Let's get them views up. All right. So I'm going to be talking about how to ground the psychedelic UFO, the pivotal potential of exceptional experience from spiritual risk to ecology of practice. So this is what's on the menu. Don't worry, not all the slides are going to be like this. We're just reading out a block of text the whole time. So exceptional human experiences, including the so-called alien abduction phenomena, have transformative potential, but they can risk disconnection from immanent reality, leading just, for instance, to things like spiritual bypassing or conspirituality. Psychedelics, like DMT, can simulate or occasion, and hopefully I'll kind of define each of those later, these kind of phenomena, including their enduring effects like their metaphysical belief shifts. And thus, they may provoke things like ontological shock, resulting in like trauma, but also potentially post-traumatic growth. But despite these risks, they offer profound opportunities, such as alleviation of existential anxiety, prosociality, well-being, and with certain practices, these can actually be reoriented toward what can be kind of referred to as eudaimonia, and I'll describe that more later, fostering things like meaning, equanimity, and self-transcendent love as pillars of a more grounded awakening. All right, so that's just kind of order of business. So what's our exceptional experiences? Joel already kind of beautifully went over this, so just for the sake of time, I'm actually just going to skip over this really, but you can kind of read it at your leisure there really, but there's 5 kind of categories which were originally schematized by Rhea White, and these kind of the prototypical kind of ones that of each of the category that I put there's examples, but we're going to be sort of focusing on it, and it kind of applies maybe in general, but I'm kind of going to be focusing on this alien abduction kind of event. So this is one of Dave Luke's slides. I don't know if he's still here, actually. Is he still here? He is. I've actually edited it. So you've got all the citations here, most of which from Dave and myself, about exceptional experiences that can be occasioned or simulated by psychedelics. And kind of put in order there, in descending order, it's in ascending order of how I sort of perceive them to be challenging to the kind of more prevailing reductionist materialist framework. The ones in black there are the kind of major categories of the exceptional experiences I mentioned, and the italicized one is really what I'm going to be talking about a bit more now. So I got an essay in the book that you would have all received. I think, according to David, won the award for the most tongue-twisted title, which I'm happy about. So just to say on that, so we can go way back to something called the Liturgy of Mithras, which was an ancient Greco-Roman theurgical kind of ritual, like invocation of deities. I looked at it, and I was like, years ago, I was like, oh, that's pretty psychedelic. And then Walter Hanegraaff, historian of religion, he actually has described that liturgy as the world's most ancient trip report, like the first trip report. And at the very end, you do actually see, in fact, a whole, like a third of the text also is actually instructions to create this potion, this sort of psychedelic potion, this mysterious, potentially most likely psychedelic ingredient, which engenders all these visions, these invocations of deities. But then I looked into it, and to me it looked very ufological. So many of the themes and features are very reminiscent of things you see in like contemporary UFO like encounter reports. So it's psychedelic kind of ufological encounters can potentially go way back. These are just some sort of major studies that have been done. Looking at this sort of interrelationship and how these experiences can be occasioned. So I did a thematic analysis of a field study that Dave originally ran and fed into my PhD, did these interviews, thematically analysed the DMT experiences that happen in naturalistic settings, a lot of, despite the PhD really being focused around how it relates to near-death experiences, a lot of the experiences are pretty abduction-y. And we asked a couple of people, especially if you look at the paper, an encounter with the other, these 2 individuals were especially reminiscent of these kinds of states. And just generally in terms of the kind of features that also mirror these kind of abduction experiences, things like the functions of these entities. Well, for instance, they're doing experimentation, for instance, maybe on these people. The way that they appear, quite evidently, like insectoid or serpentine of some nature. And these are some pretty lovely images that we got the people to sketch out what their experiences consisted of. So this was maybe the most, the experience that really most mapped onto these kinds of experiences. It's kind of entities with octopoid serpentine kind of hair, large, like classic grey, like eyes, and they were wearing surgical masks. So they weren't actually performing like medical examination, like often in these prototypical abduction cases. But he found himself lying on a slab, and he had like bright white light shining on him, and they were exceptionally curious of him, and they were like trying to show. It urgently expressed something that you couldn't quite interpret correctly, but on this like screen, melting screen with all these different symbols and imagery that they were trying to communicate to him. This one was very interesting because he was shot through this holographic digital like tunnel, and he was very, very convinced that he was dying, completely convinced he was dying, he was sort of grieving for himself and everybody. But so that, in a sense, sort of seems like a kind of DMT-ified near-death experience, which it very much seems to be, but also that, in that way, mirrors the abduction state as well, with the kind of portal-like experience, and the fact that there were these alien beings, which you refer to like the Navi from Avatar, kind of trying to look at him and talk to him. And we had another one. These sort of classic mantises healing this particular individual, like taking kind of trauma out of his face and jaw. So, but it's not just with, actually, I will just say, Andrew Gallimore has got a new book out called Death by Astonishment, and I shared with him some of our raw data. And so if you're interested in more about, you can see more of these kind of cases in that book as well. Not just DMT though, like an experiment at La Chorrera, by the McKenna brothers also, you can read that, included some of these kind of features very interestingly in high dose psilocybin. This is just a quote from a friend of mine, P.D. Newman, who's an alchemical, hermetic author, and he had a very interesting experience when he was in college, again, high dose psilocybin, where basically, you can read the red there, he had a UFO like fly into his heart, and then saw these reptilian entities, which instead of him being dismembered like a normal shamanic dismemberment, they got him to shamanically dismember one of their mates, their reptilian hive mates, and then eventually there was this kind of revelation after they decided to go into some kind of like weird sexual frenzy where they ripped each other apart, but yet were still communicating consciously and everything. He had this revelation that death doesn't exist, and immortality of consciousness. So the truth is out there, I want to believe. So abductions, they're not as in the mainstream now, in the kind of current traction that things are receiving, aren't receiving as much attention as, let's say, UFOs per se, and that might be interesting for different reasons. Maybe there's certain psychopathologies associated with them, or trends toward that, different neuroscientific models, which I'll mention. But UFOs certainly are, so I'm just going to very briefly just mention that. The watershed moment in 2017, New York Times, different journals, taking this more seriously, revealing that the Pentagon has for many years had different programs looking into the reality of UFOs. So a very kind of whole series of them. Interesting, New York Times have been reporting on this since like the 50s. And also on the congressional level, like in governments. So there's also been 3 consecutive hearings in the last 3 years dedicated to this particular topic. E.T. Just saying. And also on the scientific level as well, so that's growing traction as well. Soul Foundation, for instance, that look into that, different like Ivy League professors and blah, blah, from different disciplines, especially Gary Nolan, who oversees it, who's a Nobel Prize nominee, like multiple nominee. Again, taking this initiative to look at these experiences more scientifically. All right. Yes, so psychedelics occasion abduction experiences, as I mentioned, and that will imply that there are certain neurotransmitter systems, not least like the serotonin system or 5-HT2A, or at least convergent mechanisms thereof. And that doesn't necessarily mean that like you can just assume them materialistically, but I think that certainly in itself does emphasize the kind of spiritual, or kind of to lend from like Peter Hughes' vocabulary, like a metaphysical type nature to these kinds of experiences, these abductions, which is usually neglected, and hence I think that implies the challenging after effects themselves, which are unique to these kinds of experiences as well. And so psychedelics is a main kind of model that you can look at for these kinds of experiences, but this is just a summary of some talks that I've been doing recently about the neuroscience of abduction phenomena. So there's many different ones there, but psychedelics is a very powerful one, as well as predictive processing as well, which you can look at kind of separately, but psychedelics themselves are the main way by which they operate in the brain is through that, and that's a powerful way to think about how abductions can work as well. But I don't have time to fully go into that, nor do I have time to fully go into this, but I'm just going to mention if there is these phenomenological parallels between DMT and these abduction experiences, then you can look at DMT as another model, look at the mechanisms by how that works, and then you can kind of extrapolate to maybe similar things that are happening spontaneously in the abduction state as well. So you got things like very human-specific brain functions, which are kind of recruited when it comes to DMT, like imagination and memory and the dreamlike state. Entropy encounters. So psychedelics can lead to profound shifts in your psychological structure, right? And this can be just of a novel kind of nature. This could potentially be of a more pathological nature, and that's what I mean when I refer to the groundless kind of thing. We'll talk about that a bit more, or kind of more ungrounded kind of after effects. So when I say novel, I think there's evidence, for instance, after psychedelics, that personality can change, so you become more open, less neurotic. Political affiliations, a little bit of evidence there that can happen as well, become a bit more liberal. But also in terms of what I'm going to be focusing on really, this talk, the pathological and the ungrounded, your metaphysical beliefs can shift, right? We come away from materialism towards things like panpsychism and idealism. Your very sense of self can be completely like reconfigured, and that in itself can feel like the ground from under you being taken away, right? And in this particular study, it was called Navigating Groundlessness. I think now it's been published and it's been turned into Learning from Groundlessness. Enduring challenging experiences after psychedelics, basically. Many interesting reports of people really grieving themselves because they were changed so fundamentally and they can't ever access that again. And these things, these kind of experiences can lead to ontological shock, right? Your world, your whole cosmology has been totally shattered and you're left to pick up the pieces of it, right? In terms of more ungrounded after effects that can happen, there can potentially be these sort of more undiscerning, let's say, uncritical kind of thinking styles, things like eccentricities into your personality, and that can be related to some sub-traits of schizotypy. Atypical beliefs, inflation, ego, conspiritual type thinking, and these encounters with these alien type entities can also lead to these kinds of things. And so potentially these psychedelic alien abductions may kind of represent a sort of perfect storm for these potentialities to come about. And just on a kind of neuroscientific level, just mention a bit more about that regarding the groundlessness and ungrounded state. These psychedelic alien encounters may be in their like additive, profound removal just from the quotidian, from everyday way of being, may be undergirded by quite dramatic neural shifts, which may have deleterious kind of outcomes. Functional plasticity, heightened cortical entropy, which is a kind of measure of uncertainty in the brain, beyond the point of criticality at which our brain is sort of normally poised, giving way to things like pivotal mental states, which is a sort of the volatility of the valence of the experience. Was that a 10-minute mark? Oh, you were just shuffling. Okay, freaking me out, Dan. All right. Yeah, just a little bit more about that. Yeah, so world models, our world models of the world are probabilistically encoded in belief priors, which support a sense of certainty, and dismantling of these can manifest as a sense of groundlessness. Just a little bit more about that. Yeah, so priors, neural annealing, can be maladaptive, kind of the making of your brain in sort of subtle states, where it can then refigure afterwards if the experience themselves or the integration afterwards is functional. That resetting of the brain can be deleterious. But yeah, let's look a bit more about what actually are these potential ungrounded or groundless states. Focusing on the former, the sort of groundless state. Psychedelic exceptional experiences being conceived of potentially like transpersonal phenomena. Experiences, I think, can often miss that opportunity to integrate them such that their inter and intrapersonal value is embraced. Hence, these kind of following possible consequences being maybe tangible dangers, so spiritual bypassing, the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, unfinished developmental tasks. Toxic kind of conspirituality is a fascinating concept. So defined here as a politico-spiritual philosophy that merges New Age beliefs with conspiratorial thinking based on conviction that a secret group controls the social political order while humanity is undergoing spiritual emergence or emergency. Thinking about sort of psychedelic acceptance experience relevance here, things like reptilian extraterrestrials are covertly controlling all the world's institutions or ensnaring us in some kind of simulation. And I'm the one that's been chosen to receive this truth in order to help awaken you. Okay? Maybe it's true, maybe not. Oh no, it's a bit smudged up there. Something about cults. Yeah. Am I going to go to read that? Yeah, so... Something about Heaven's Gate. These UFO kind of cults, especially psychedelic cults, obviously lying at the extreme of this, but can be still an illustrative end of the spectrum there. So that was Heaven's Gate, basically. Yeah, so they had this idea that their souls were going to be recycled and they were going to have salvation, which relied on leaving their bodies, ascending to a higher existence on a spacecraft, trailing the Hellhop planet. And ultimately, almost 40 members committed mass suicide to that very end. Interestingly, there's no direct evidence, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Is that the right way of putting it? That he himself, Applewhite, was, had been taking psychedelics, etc. But certainly, I think when you look into it, the themes and everything, and the time, the context of which it was, certainly indirectly influenced by the psychedelic New Age. And there is known that many of the members themselves were having these experiences. Okay, Laser Quest. So this is one which sort of combines them all, really, all of these in some way, shape, or form. So this is just a screenshot from a private group chat with alleviations, and I'm not going to read it all there, but I do recommend taking a photo of it. He gave me permission, don't worry. So I don't know who's heard of Danny Gover's Laser Quest. He called it Laser Quest. Put your hand up. I'm seeing cameras up. Put your hands up high on the cameras. Okay. Some people. That's interesting. So basically, Danny Gover, he said, "Smoke DMT, look at my laser, and you'll see that some kind of alien language code of reality just sort of appear in front of your eyes and constitute in this laser thing." So big kind of claim. But yeah, read it, take a picture. I couldn't really have said it better myself than Ali about this. But basically, it's speaking to this kind of vapid hyper-attention to this alleged ontological revelation at the expense of any real practical utility or intrapersonal insight, which can otherwise very possibly be drawn from that DMT state. And basically, just TLDR, look at the very end, and Ali basically said, "I think it's bollocks." Heart, 4 thumbs up. Mine was the heart. All right. So going from these kind of atypical kind of beliefs and these things that I've just expanded to more kind of potential pathological sort of states afterward. So there has been some arguments that ontological shock can potentially be, after the psychedelic stage, can be a mechanism by which these experiences can lead to cognitive flexibility and their therapeutic effects, right? But really, this itself, this kind of ontological shock, is certainly a source of enduring existential challenges. And that's something which the Learning from Grounded's paper talked about a lot. This kind of shock from these psychedelic exceptional experiences may eventually result in profound personal insight or post-traumatic growth, right? And again, that's really, make sure if you look at that paper, look at the end for something a bit less depressing and actually very inspiring at the end of that paper about this kind of potential for post-traumatic growth. Very moving. But again, there may still be quite traumatic, resulting in things like derealization, which that paper goes into also. Researchers like John Mack and Ken Ring was a pioneer in NDEs, but actually also looked at UFOs that people were less familiar with, and John Mack really pioneered the study of abduction experiences as well. And they kind of both independently had the sort of idea that there was some kind of important sort of awakening with these people that had these kinds of experiences. Ring kind of went even further and sort of said that they're like these instrumental nodes in the whole collective awakening of humanity. But that hasn't really been rigorously looked at and differentiated from things like dissociation, these kind of altered states that can linger, with things like spiritual emergence and emergency. I'm just going to skip over that, but it's just a fun title. So people can generate these different kind of ontologies after these experiences, and they can have negative enduring effects in some way, but they can certainly also lead to very desirable after effects. So focusing on psychedelics is a litany of such changes of a psychospiritual nature. So, as I mentioned, shift towards panpsychism or idealism, alleviation of death anxiety, an increase in mindfulness, elevation of connection to nature, prosociality and altruism, etc. And there's evidence actually in different papers they all correlate in some way with well-being itself. And so coming back to the UFO abduction phenomenon, all of these are in some way not as rigorously demonstrated as with the psychedelic literature, but there's many allusions that after these experiences as well, similar after effects can happen. And something that I've argued in previous talks is that all of this can converge on eudaimonia. So eudaimonia was the ancient Greek concept of flourishing, a bit more than that, sort of excellence and virtue, but it's also been translated as flourishing. This is a paper, thank you Dave for this, sort of a review of positive psychology outcomes and things related to psychedelics. So just highlighting these here, especially relevant for things like eudaimonia, the increase in prosociality, empathy, self-transcendence. This is a survey that Dave's doing with a number of his students, still in preparation, basically. It's a survey of the enduring effects of psychedelic exceptional experiences, of which there's very, very little research. So this is really great and pioneering. There's a lot about the phenomenology, etc., but the potential enduring effects after psychedelic exceptional experiences, the research kind of thin on the ground. So here. I'm just going to continue from borrowing from the ancient Greeks, which I find very useful. So I've kind of linked the after effects here to these sort of number of Greek philosophical concepts to capture the different dimensions of achieving the state of eudaimonia. Right? So we've got feelings of happiness and well-being, which can be maybe quite directly linked in sense of eudaimonia. Sense of purpose or meaning, so the logos, which means meaning in ancient Greek, focus on living in the present and not thinking about fears for the future, etc. So that can maybe link to things like ataraxia, which can be translated to liberation or equanimity. And I think most importantly, so we have a sense of connection to others, ability to express love, desire to help others, agape, so this important particular form of love, self-transcendent love. This is a paper, Spontaneous Spiritual Awakenings, This is just the excerpt which describes what that even is, and there's many, many characteristics all just highlighted there for you, but there's no real definitive definition of it. But I think, in my humble opinion, I think you could eliminate any one of these features I've circled here, and you could still potentially delineate it as a quote-unquote awakening. But these dimensions, sacredness, gratitude, reverence, especially the sense of love and unconditional love, that's the difference that makes a difference, really. And I basically, I think it's the height of this sort of ungrounded, potentially narcissistic, post-exceptional experience state, which has all of these other elements, except this one, okay? And it's only really given one shout out there, regrettably. Thank you, man. And just to say that in the Tibetan Buddhist Mahayana tradition, there's a prerequisite that in order to gain full enlightenment, you need to develop so-called bodhicitta, right? It's this sort of compassion such that you want to eliminate the suffering of all beings and lead everyone to awakening prior to your own, you know? And in Shanti Deva's book, The Way of the Bodhisattva, there's 2 chapters dedicated to this idea that once you glimpse that kind of awakening, which can be just fleeting, or can be these kinds of shaky or ungrounded sort of states that I'm referring to here, which is sort of asymptotically getting there, but not quite, that you have a responsibility to transmute that into this kind of full awakening, which has this bodhicitta, which has this sense of love and compassion. So yes, not only might there be some kind of sort of potential, albeit context dependent, for these kinds of transformations after psychedelic exceptional experiences, but a synergy of intentional behaviors, or what can be referred to as an ecology of practice, which John Vervaeke has spoken about, mainly regarding awakening itself, and Ali Biner has spoken about mainly in terms of applying it to technology like AI. So yeah, these practices, like all of the following here that I just listed for you, and again corresponding to some Greek approaches, they're either at the level of preparation or integration, so they may be employed to transmute these kinds of experiences into ones of a more grounded nature. And so again, this is talking to how when it becomes these experiences and their enduring effects can become a bit more groundless, right? And this is an image from that Learning from Groundlessness paper, and it's about what helps. So the participants were asked what helps them get out of this groundless state, so such that they can even begin to integrate their experiences, right? Integration is like incorporating the lessons, etc., but you can't even do that if you're completely destabilized in and of itself, right? And the vast majority of participants said that this is about grounding, hence the paper, right? So, which would mirror kind of more of a reintegration of the self. And those themselves, you can see them on the left-hand column mostly here. They interestingly mirror a lot of these previous things that I just listed through there, the potential practices. Psychedelic apprenticeship. So yeah, again, developing a light touch to these kinds of revelations and things, which can be potentially destabilizing on grounding or leading to the groundless state. Kristen referred to it as epiphany porn. I kind of like noetic narcosis. That's another one I sort of thought. So 1 minute. How much have we got? 2 minutes. So lastly, it's what really does a well-integrated like psychedelic exceptional experience, or psychedelic alien encounter exceptional experience look like? Ali Biner, interestingly, at the Turing Initiative that I think Joe mentioned in the introduction, he was speaking about his DMTX participation, right? And I'm just going to throw just a couple of examples of this, but I was struck by this one because it was a very, very out there thing. You know, it's a long-term DMT, like half an hour intravenous, and he had this encounter with this like giant female spider alien entity. And you can think that's pretty like removed from your everyday, but you know, he was actually really able to extract very profound lessons on the relationship with his wife in terms of intimacy in a very deep intrapersonal way. So this is the very last thing I'm going to say. This is from one of my papers, An Encounter with the Self. You can see there's a bit of a theme there. which is sort of the less recognized one, which is weird because it's, far from the whole DMT entity like fixation that many people have. And this was focusing on the self and the very profound, like what the implications of these experiences were for these people's humanity, right? And very, very poignant, profound emotional experiences they were having. So this was one of the participants, and this is the same participant that had this alien encounter with these mantis entities with giant eyes. Okay, so he had a relatively typical like alien encounter experience. But he talks about taking an extreme cautionary stance despite his manifest potential for a profound encounter with the principle of love, which one may take into their lives, which is what he was experiencing. And I think this sort of exemplifies a final implication really of what I'm getting at. You can have all of these far out trippy encounters, right? But they can lead to these psycho-spiritual grounding, groundless sort of states, which may require years of further grounding, integration, etc. So here he, do we really have to go through all of that? And he says here, is it just better to live in the matrix and try to find love and be love, find humility and be humility, try and live and try and be everything you can without these kind of extraordinary experiences? So ultimately, if these insights of some people who do go and return are so simple and beautifully elegant like this, it's certainly possible that we can reside in a more inborn realization of this, which I think is that truer awakening. So, synopsis, thank you very much.